Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural edition of what we hope becomes a lecture series which will help to aid forwarding legal and socio-political discourse, legal theory and socio-political theoretical discourse in legal academia. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you something about how this idea was conceived and why we called it dialogues. So the idea behind this session, as you know, is to conduct a series of interactive lectures instead of plainly one-sided lectures, so that there is engagement among people who have their own ideas about philosophy from what they've read, and to sort of make them contribute to with an expert so that we can have a level of discussion that enriches everyone's understanding. The idea of dialogues, as you know, has some sort of historical significance to the discipline of philosophy. We know that Plato used to write in a dialogic form. We know Aristotle also did, but unfortunately, Aristotle's dialogic form of writing hasn't survived. What we have is more of a prose that appears more like notes of works rather than dialogues, the way that we have of Plato. But the idea of dialectic, even though the dialogic form of writing is no longer prevalent, the idea of dialogue and dialectic has found its place very deeply in philosophy. We can see how philosophers like Hegel and Nietzsche talked about their own ideas of dialectics and etc. And one of the most famous instances that sort of inspired this series was when in 1980s, the journalist Claire Parnett approached the philosopher Gilles Deleuze for a series of TV interviews, to which Deleuze very reluctantly agreed with a few conditions. One of his first conditions was this interview will not be called interview. Rather, it will be called dialogues, because he hated the idea of an interview and he hated giving interviews. And the second condition was that all of the clips will be aired after his death. So the series that came out of it, Les Bicidières, is available on YouTube as a series of dialogues between Claire Parnett and Gilles Deleuze, where they discuss issues concerning Deleuze philosophy. And it is massively interesting and is one of the inspirations for this series. Of course, the point here being not to replicate what came before, but to see what we ourselves can do with this idea of dialogue, and let's see where we can take it. Particular to this lecture, as you all know, we are doing it on Aurobindo to celebrate the fact that the year 2022 marks the 150th anniversary of Aurobindo. So we have here perhaps a person whose expertise on Aurobindo is greater than anyone else in the legal academia. Mr. Raag Yadava. A little short introduction to Mr. Yadav. Mr. Yadav graduated from National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, and then he served as a judicial clerk to a justice in High Court of Delhi, and then as a research associate at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. And while he was at National Law University, National Law School, he served as the convening editor of many prominent journals like the International Journal of the Indian Journal of International Economic Law, and the Journal of the Indian Journal of Law and Technology, and he has published extensively. He was also the convener of the academic group program and the student initiative, initiative to promote legal awareness, and also the Moot Court Society. He was also the winner of the Philip C. Jessup International Moot Court Competition, perhaps one of the most well-known achievement for which everyone in law school still knows Raag. And of course, he was awarded the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship and to Oxford. And now currently he's serving as an assistant professor at his alma mater, National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. We welcome you, sir. Thank you very much for gracing us with your presence today. So before we begin with the core of our discussion, I believe Mr. Yadav has a short presentation for everyone to make us familiar with the ideas of Aurobindo, so that we'll be able to contribute to these lectures in a better manner. And if during the entire discussion the audience have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll take them towards the end. I highly encourage everyone to ask questions. Thank you. Over to you, Raag, sir.
Okay, hi. First, just let me check that everyone can hear me.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah. Okay. So first, thanks, Abhineet, for inviting me. I was very happy that NLU Delhi has a philosophy club. It's not usual to find philosophy clubs in law schools in India. So I'm glad that you're doing that. Thank you also for that trip down memory lane, reminding me of things that happened long ago. So that was nice. Abhineet wanted to, as he explained, conduct this as a dialogue rather than a lecture. And I think that's a nice format to take it forward. But what I thought may be useful, especially because Sri Aurobindo is quite his collected works, his writings are quite vast, and he's perhaps not that well known as a philosopher. It'd be useful to have a quick 5 to 7 minute introduction to Sri Aurobindo, both biographically and an introduction to his works, to his ideas, just to be able to ground our dialogue and to give some of you who perhaps may not have heard of him or have read him somewhat of an idea of who he is and where he's coming from. So is my screen visible? Is the presentation visible?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay, great. So I'll just start with some biographical details and then give you a sense of his collected works. So Sri Aurobindo was, so he was born on 15th August 1872. As it happens, and many years later, his birthday also was the Indian Independence Day, which was a fact that he took to be a sanction for the work that he was doing. So he was born on 15th August, and almost immediately, within a couple of years of being born, he was sent off. So he to Loreto House in Darjeeling, and he never really lived with his family. And after 5 years in Darjeeling, he was sent to England at the age of 7 by his father, who was a medical doctor. Now it's very interesting. His father was an Anglophile, was a man who was enamored of British culture, was a man who was enamored of, like many were at that time, of the Indian civil service. And so his idea was to send his 3 children, Sri Aurobindo and his 2 other brothers, to England to acquire English culture, tastes and manners. And they were sent with the express instruction not to make the acquaintance of Indian culture. I always found this to be an interesting fact, because this was a man who would later be described by Lord Curzon as the most dangerous man in India and a leader of the Indian nationalist movement. But his life began with express instruction by his parents to precisely do the opposite. Now, so he went to England at the age of 7, and he stayed in London till the age of 17. While he was a precocious, prodigious young character, he taught himself Latin, Greek, Italian, and Spanish to be able to read the classics in the original. And so by the time he was 16, he had already read the classics in these languages by himself. And so he was thought to be, by his tutors and by his university professors later on, to be quite a prodigious talent. While he was in England, he was, because a large part of his writing later on in life is on matters of religion and spiritual thought, he was exposed to a number of evangelicals, which he didn't take too kindly to, because he thought them to be extremely sentimental and emotional characters who were given to large outbursts of devotion, but he didn't particularly think that they demonstrated any real intelligence or knowledge. So he grew up generally, he describes himself as generally agnostic or even atheistic. So religion wasn't something that played a large part in his life while growing up. Now I'm saying all of this and I'm giving you some background so that you get a scape of how his views in his life changed, right? So a lot of the development that happened in his life was not as a result of influences as a part of his upbringing, but they were sort of things that he developed independent of cultural influences, right? So that's always a good question to ask of any great figure or writer, whether their views were influenced or were contingent on the upbringing that they had, on the time and place and the culture in which they were brought up. But there seems to be that kind of correlation with him seems to be slightly difficult to draw. So after having gone through his schooling in London, in 1889, he went to King's College in Cambridge to study the classics. This was with a scholarship which was gotten on the recommendation of the very famous British educationalist and public personality Oscar Browning. He did very well in his tripos in Cambridge, and true to his father's wishes, who wanted him to enter the Indian civil service, which was sort of the highest thing that an Indian in the UK, in Britain, could do at the time. He passed the written examination, but at the time there used to be an examination because you had to be not just a good administrator but also a gentleman. There was a horse riding test that he had to pass in order to become a member of the Indian civil service, and he decided to fail the horse riding test by not showing up on time. And so he gave up his seat as a member of the Indian civil service at the time. Behind the scenes, this was obviously unknown to his father or to most other people at the time. He was already at the young age of 14 to 20, beginning to feel for Indian independence. He was beginning to, he says that the roots, the foundations for fighting for my country, for fighting for my people, were laid in that early adolescent period. And he was a member of a secret society at Cambridge, which was called the Lotus and Dagger Society, which was a society meant to promote and assist in the Indian independence, Indian nationalist movement. We're still in 1892-93, so we're still at least 2-3 decades away from the growth of the Indian nationalist movement in its full form. So it's quite remarkable that as early on, there were a group of people, of young people, studying in the UK who had the daring and the courage to start thinking up these extremely radical ideas at the time. So anyway, he failed the horse riding test and managed to land a job with the Gaikwar of Baroda, who was an extremely progressive figure, and he's an interesting man to study in and of his own right, and perhaps you can think about doing that at some point in time. So he got a job with the Gaikwar of Baroda, and he landed in India by ship in 1893. As it so happens, there were his father who was waiting for him at Bombay, and Sri Aurobindo was his prize son. So he was waiting for his son to return to India after 13 long years of separation. His father died because a ship with the same name as the ship by which Sri Aurobindo was coming to India, but a different ship, sank. And his father died in shock, waiting for his son to come back. So when Sri Aurobindo landed in India, he found that his father had passed away. But he describes a very interesting experience that when he landed at the Apollo Bandar in Bombay, he felt a vast calm descend upon him. And he felt that this was his first initiation, his first interaction with his karma bhumi, with the place of his work. And he took it as a sign of some importance that upon entry into India, he felt he had his first major spiritual experience, which he said stayed with him for some time. He stayed in the service of the Gaikwar of, pardon me, He stayed in the service of the Gaikwar of Baroda for 14 long years, from 1893 to about 1905. He started off as a small administrator in the Department of Revenue, and he taught French at the local college, but he rose in prominence in the service of the Gaikwar of Baroda. He was probably on his way to becoming a Diwan, which was a very high position in the princely states, and he had become the principal of the local college. Now, during these 14 years, he taught himself Sanskrit and Bengali, and till he had landed in India, he had no knowledge of any Indian language. He knew some basic Hindustani with which he used to speak to the house helps when he was a young child, but he knew no Indian language. He had never stayed in India. So this was, for all intents and purposes, a complete Westerner who had never lived or stayed in India. So for a period of 14 years, from about 20 to 34, he studied and he read voluminous amounts. He taught himself Sanskrit and Bengali and studied Indian scripture as a sort of preparation for his nationalist work and for his later life. So usually this period is what is described as the preparatory period for the later flowering of his genius. I just want to say this as a small remark, is that this period of his life is actually the period of his life where all of you are right now. So he was a college student. He graduated. He was smart. He was wanted to do all sorts of great things, much like all of you. And then he spent a long period of time sort of preparing himself, creating the necessary ground to be able to conduct the actions that he wanted to later on. In 1906, by this time, the sort of thirst that he had for helping the Indian independence movement, which he had as a child at the age of 14 in Britain, had sort of completely flowered. And by this time, he was a growing figure in the Indian nationalist movement, and he was especially quite popular amongst the youth. So he left his high-ranking job in the service of the Gaikwar of Baroda, much like he left his job in the ICS earlier. And he decided to become the first principal of the National College in Calcutta. Now, the National College was a progressive institution at the time, which was just set up. It was perhaps the progenitor of some of the liberal arts institutions that we have today. He moved to the National College because he believed that the education of the youth was, for him, extremely important as a political tool, a tool to activate the next generation, which was going to carry us forward to independence, because he felt that the moderates of the Congress had taken a very passive approach towards Indian independence and so on and so forth. So he was appointed as the principal of the National College in Calcutta. Now, around this time, three very important things happened. The first thing that happened was, I perhaps move to the next slide. Yeah, he's published two journals called the Karma Yogin and the Bande Mataram. Now, the Karma Yogin and the Bande Mataram were weeklies which were published by Sri Aurobindo, which were the mouthpiece at the time of the Indian nationalist movement between 1905 and 1910. Both these volumes are available with us today. And it is in these pages, in these volumes, that the demand in the modern nationalist movement for the first time for complete independence, for Swadeshi, boycott, and very importantly, a system of national education was put forward, right? So in these 5 years, he rose to prominence as a leader of the nationalist movement. He was responsible for, he chaired several meetings of the Congress, including the famous split at Surat, when there is a wonderful photo of him sitting next to Tilak. And it is as early as this time that these ideas of complete independence began to gain prominence. They were only sort of acted upon later on, almost 2 decades later on, when Gandhi and Jinnah, etc., came into the fold. But the first ideals were actually established at this time. So the first really important thing that happened at this time was the publication of these two journals, the Karma Yogin and the Bande Mataram, which were the philosophical basis, if I can call it that, of the nationalist movement, right? It's equivalent to perhaps Thomas Paine's work during the American independence movement, or say what Voltaire was to the French independence movement, right? The second thing that happened, which was very important, was at this time, Sri Aurobindo met Till this time, he had not practiced any spiritual discipline. He had read a lot of Indian scripture, but aside from simple practice of pranayama, which was good for health, and he said it helped me with my poetry, he was not spiritually inclined or religiously inclined in any serious way. He was a teacher, he was an administrator, he was becoming a political leader, but he was not particularly interested in spiritual matters. But in 1907, he met a Maharashtrian yogi by the name of Vishnu Bhaskar Lele. Vishnu Bhaskar Lele and Sri Aurobindo secluded themselves in an apartment in near Bombay for 3 days. And in those 3 days came Sri Aurobindo's first major spiritual experience, which is the Advaitic experience of the Nirguna Brahman, or the impersonal absolute. Right? This is the experience where he felt that the entire world had dissolved in a cinematographic play of forms. So the reality of the world, the permanence of the world had vanished for him. And what remained only was an impermanent play of forms, right? So this is what's described as a very great experience in Advaita Vedanta of the Nirguna Brahman. Nirguna meaning without guna, right? Nirguna, the attributeless or the impersonal form of the absolute. So he had this spiritual experience at this time. Now, what's very important as a third point to note at this phase, and this will go on into the next, into our discussion as well, is that his spiritual work and his experiences and his discipline went in parallel with his political work. Right? There was a trend of a sort of ascetic life denying spiritual discipline or sadhana or practice, which was quite popular in India at the time. And one of Sri Aurobindo's core contributions to the field of spiritual thinking, which perhaps we'll speak about and I'll end in a couple of minutes, is the idea of a life-affirming spirituality. So here was a leader of the nationalist movement engaged in political conflict, in political violence, but engaging in spiritual discipline at the same time, at achieving the highest levels of experience. So for him, the idea, in line with the doctrine of the Gita, was of a life-affirming spiritual discipline, not of a life-denying spiritual ascetic discipline where you have a retreat into the forest or a retreat into the cave, right? There is a very famous and interesting quote where he can be quite a savage writer at times. So he used to say that if spiritual thought is only a cis Himalayan hothouse splendor, then that's not for me. The idea meaning that if I need to give up my life, if I need to give up my nation, and I need to go cis Himalayan hothouse splendor, which is a wonderful way of putting, of describing the ascetic disciplines. He had enormous respect for it, but he felt that that was not the ideal that needed to motivate the Indian people at the time. So in any case, in 1909, very famously, he was arrested for the Alipoor bomb conspiracy case. Sri Aurobindo was never a pacifist. He described him, he believed in the use of violence when required. He had spent his own money in equipping the youth of the time and trying to make bombs and so on and so forth. And he believed in a very careful strategic use of violence when required. There's a very interesting conversation to be had between his views on violence and say Gandhiji's, but that's a separate discussion altogether. So he was arrested for the Alipoor bomb conspiracy case. As it happened, he was acquitted because he didn't participate in that. He was acquitted in part through the efforts of a wonderful and very famous lawyer, C.R. Das. Since I'm speaking to law students, some of you may be interested in looking at the records. We have the records of that case available. And C.R. Das's speech and his advocacy during the Alipoor bomb conspiracy case is one of the most extraordinary records of a famous trial that we have. So I would encourage all of you, if you have time, to go and look at the trial records for that case. Now, in 1909, when he was arrested, he was put in jail. He was put in solitary confinement. In that year, he read the Gita, he practiced what he called the sadhana of the Gita, and he had the second major spiritual experience, which was the experience not of the Nirguna Brahman, but of the Saguna Brahman. Saguna Brahman is the experience not of the transcendental God or the God away from the world, What of the God in the world, the immanent Godhead in the world, right? So this is the second major Vedantic experience that Sri Aurobindo had in jail. Very interestingly, when he left jail when he was acquitted in 1909, he came out and very famously said that the only result of the British incarcerating me was that I found God. So he came out of jail. He very famously gave the Uttar Para speech, which was a speech where he proclaimed and announced to the world that God had spoken to him in jail, that he had a range of spiritual experiences, and that it was the Indian nation, he said, it was the time now for the Indian nation to rise. And there was, he spoke with a religious fervor about the Indian nationalist movement in the Uttar Para speech, sort of exhorting the youth of the country to fight for their land, to fight for India, to fight for the freedom of the mother. Now, this was in 1909. In 1910, after having these sort of 5 years of very intense political activity through the journals, through his incarceration, through his participation in the Congress at the Surat session, he was asked to be president of the Congress, which he declined. In 1910, he took a boat and went from Calcutta down to Pondicherry. And just like that, overnight, this sort of intense, fiery political fighter was lost to the nationalist movement, or so it was thought. And for the next 40 years, from 1910 to 1950, he spent his time in Pondicherry till his death. He never left that town. And this is where he developed the system, his philosophical system, which occupies about 20 volumes, called the Integral Yoga. Most of this, very interestingly, was written between 1914 and 20 in a 6-year period in a journal called the Arya. And the Arya contains most of his major works, which I'll just outline. 2 points here. Sri Aurobindo was not alone. When he went to Pondicherry, he met, like many of you would have seen in photos of him, his spiritual collaborator, the mother. The mother is the name that was given to her in the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Her name was Mira Alfasa. She was a French woman of Turkish descent and a accomplished mystic and a yogi of the highest order as well. So this is where Sri Aurobindo and the mother, Mira Alfasa, began in 1926, the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Which was a very small, it's not like one of our large ashrams with hundreds of people milling about and so on and so forth. It was a very small concentrated community for the practice of the discipline that we call the integral yoga. Now, from 1926 to 1950, Sri Aurobindo went into seclusion, which is that he did not meet people physically at all after that, but he corresponded very actively through letters. Now, I mentioned this for one very simple practical fact, is that all of these letters are available with us today. So we have about 10 volumes of letters that are available to us today of him interacting with his disciples, him interacting with political leaders, with thinkers, with poets, and so on and so forth, all of which is available to us, which is very rare for great personalities of this kind, because usually the records are not, things that we have in written physical form. So in 1926, he went into seclusion, and in 1950, on 5th December, he passed away. He left his body. I've just mentioned 2 facts here because I thought they're useful. I just want to point them out, and perhaps some of you, those of you interested, may later want to look at it. There's 2 very interesting incidents that happened in 1914 and 21, when the Khilafat movement later on came about with Gandhiji, when the question of the introduction of Muslims into the political sphere and so on and so forth was being discussed. There were very interesting series of comments then at that time where Sri Aurobindo argued against the politicization of religion, against the Khilafat movement. And that is an interesting area of study. I just want to mark it out for those of you who are interested. And the second was in 1942, he recommended the acceptance of the Cripps proposal, arguing that this could stave off partition. In fact, he had foreseen the possibility of a partition in 1914 with the beginning of the separate electorate system. So because that is such a major fissure in India, I just wanted to outline some thoughts that usually are you may not find in your history textbooks. But there was this sort of alternate dialogue being conducted around the politicization of religion and partition from a very early time onwards, 1914 onwards. Now, very quickly, this is the left is Sri Aurobindo right after he was acquitted from the Alipoor conspiracy case and when he went to Pondicherry. And the right is a photo taken in the late 1940s. This is a few years before he passed away. For those of you who are interested, the photo on the right was actually taken by a very famous photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson. For those of you who are interested in details of photography. So this is the man. Now I'll just end with this. So what did he do from 1910 onwards? From 1910 to 1950, we have two kinds of writings by Sri Aurobindo. The first is, all of this occupies a close to about 30 volumes. The first is his philosophical thought. Now there are two categories of this. The first is his original philosophical thought. And the second is exegetical work. Exegetical work is commentary on existing scripture. Now, his three original works are The Life Divine, which is his view of the universe and man's place in it, his view of Genesis in prose. Savitri, which is the same subject but dealt with in poetry, where he's taken the legend of the Mahabharata of the tale of Satyavan and Savitri and built on that his spiritual philosophy. And the third is a very practical document, which is called the Synthesis of Yoga, where he takes different yogic disciplines that you would have heard of. Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, the Tantric Yoga, the Yoga of the Gita, and so on and so forth. And he provides a sort of synthetic assessment of the pros and cons of each of these different spiritual disciplines. Now, these are his three original philosophical works. His exegetical works are essays on the Gita, which is a book-length commentary on the Gita. The second is a very important work, which is The Secret of the Veda, which is a work that looks to the symbolic meaning of the Rig Veda, which is something that Sri Aurobindo argued had been lost in literal explanations of the Veda or naturalistic explanations of the Veda, right? The sort of idea that Max Muller speaks about, where when you speak about Agni, you're worshipping the fire. When you speak about Indra or you speak about Soma, you're actually looking for a plant or something else. So the idea was that these were representatives of deeper symbolic inner truths. They were basically psychological documents. So that is outlined in The Secret of the Veda, which is a wonderful discussion on the symbolic meaning and the poetry of the Veda as well, right? Because Sri Aurobindo was, before being a philosopher, he was a poet. So there is a wonderful discussion on the poetry. And then you have commentaries on the major Upanishads, especially the Isha, Kena, and Katha Upanishad, right? So these are his exegetical works. Then we come to his political thought. I've already mentioned, now again, there are two sort of sets here. As a political leader, he wrote Karma Yoga and Vande Mataram. I think for law students, these are wonderful documents. They contain short 4 to 5 page essays, not more than that, commenting on issues of the day, right? So it's almost like a op-ed, right? It's like an editorial, but it's written in the ferment of the nationalist movement. So that's Vande Mataram and Karma Yoga, and a third journal called the Dharma. And the other three works are his mega histories, his political philosophy works, which are called The Human Cycle, Ideal of Human Unity, and War and Self-Determination, where he provides a mega history of the world, much like Marx or Eric Hobsbawm, etc. A mega history of the world, speaking about where it all began and where our societies are going in terms of a divine teleology. That is, our societies have an end; they are going towards something, and that something is only to be explained in a spiritual culmination of the underlying unity and harmony in societies manifesting itself. So that's what his works look like. I've taken way more time than I had to. This is the Vande Mataram that I was speaking about. So it was a daily. It was published in this form. So imagine getting this in your email or your post every week, something like this, right? The rest, I'm just going to put it on the screen, but perhaps as and when we go through the discussion, we can refer to it as well.
Thank you, Raag sir, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure the audience is in raptures with this very enlightening discussion on Aurobindo's life. So from here, my co-host Ayan and I will be taking the discussion forward. So, sir, firstly, what I would like you to reflect on is what you said concerning the life-denying and life-affirming views, which I found very interesting because it is the similar sort of idea that many Western philosophers like Nietzsche were trying to propound. And what I'm curious about is that Nietzsche saw both Platonism and Vedanta as being opposed to a life-affirming philosophy, in the sense that they were life-denying, because of Vedanta's ideas of Maya and how, everything that is material is but an illusion, and we need to look at a higher reality in order to experience the truth. So how did Aurobindo sort of juggle with this contradiction, and how did he put forward his life-affirming philosophy through this?
Right, so that's a great question. So let's take two major sort of sources of what we usually call life-denying or ascetic or illusionistic spiritual thought. The first is Adi Shankaracharya and his Advaita Vedanta, and the second is the Buddha's idea of illusionism. Now, the idea in these schools of thought is that ultimately this world that we see around us, this world of names and forms, right, of nama and rupa, is ultimately, once you come to an enlightened state of being, is a hallucination, it's an illusion, it's maya, it's unreal. So what's the end purpose of life? Ultimately, the end purpose of life is mukti or moksha, which is that you leave this world, and in a state of nirvikalpa samadhi, you go to the nirguna brahman, right? The nirguna brahman is the impersonal absolute, right? That's the highest state of being in which your individuality merges with the divine individuality, right? So the individual, in a sense, is sort of an illusion. And once you reach that higher state of being, then you realize that ultimately the only thing to be done is to reject this world in sort of an ascetic rejection of the world and achieve that highest state. Now, Sri Aurobindo obviously disagreed with this, but before I say why, this is a very high state of being, right? So it's not to say that what Adi Shankaracharya or the Buddha was speaking about can be easily discarded, etc. What they were speaking about was that there is an ultimate reality beyond this current, this reality that we have of the life, mind, and body, right? Which is the three sort of constituents of our existence. There is an ultimate reality, right, which is a spiritual state, which is made up of, which is not described by our current state, not described by suffering. It's described by ananda, by bliss. It's not described by disharmony. It's described by harmony. It's not described by this little death-bound mortality that we have. It's described by an everlasting immortality, right? So that was the state to which they were speaking about, and they spoke from experience, right? So this is not just intellectual philosophy, right? One of the core things about Indian philosophy, this is extremely, extremely important, is Indian metaphysics, Indian philosophy was not just intellectual gymnastics. It was spoken of from experience. Ultimately, all sort of intellectual gymnastics, whatever else you do, was as a way, as a tool, as an instrument to ultimately lead to that spiritual experience. That was very important, right? And that's not necessarily what you will find in Nietzsche. Right? Now, having said this, so you have this argument of Maya, you have this argument of illusionism, which says that there is a deeper reality which we must access, and it's not this bodily reality that we have in this world of phenomena, in this phenomenal world. Now, what Sri Aurobindo says is, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that those states of being exist, right? He himself had the experience, like I said, of the Nirguna Brahman, the Advaitic experience he had with Vishnu Bhaskar Lele in 1907. He saw the world, he describes, these are his words I'm quoting, he saw the world as a cinematographic play of forms. He says, all that I thought was real dissolved into impermanence. Right? Now, this he's speaking about as a concrete experience that he had. This is not imagination. This is not sort of he's letting his intellect run away by creating some kind of wonderful story. This was in his experience, like it is in the experience of all great spiritual masters who have spoken about this. So he says, I agree with that experience. That's the experience of the impersonal absolute, the divine experience. He says, I agree with that. He says, from that perspective, if I look back at this world, it does seem unreal. It does seem like it's Maya. It does seem it's illusion. But he says that is a partial realization. It's not a full realization. Once we go ahead from that, we realize that not only is God outside the world in that transcendent experience, right? The impersonal experience, but God is also in the world, the immanent Godhead, right? And that is what we call Saguna Brahman. So guna means quality, nirguna means without quality. So that means attributeless, right? That's in the transcendent aspect, the calm, static aspect. And then you have the dynamic or the saguna aspect, which is God being able to see God in this world, being able to see that underlying unity of Brahman in this world as a matter of experience. So what he argues is that I don't disagree with the experience that say Adi Shankaracharya had or with the Buddha had. Those are extremely high experiences and they're extraordinary experiences to have. But he says that they are not the ultimate experience. Right? Let me offer, there is a wonderful metaphor given by Sri Ramakrishna, with whom Sri Aurobindo had close relations. Sri Ramakrishna has this metaphor of a stair. So he says there are two states of being. He calls them jnana and vijnana. These are both terms found in the Gita. So he says the jnani, right? Jnana means knowledge. By knowledge, I don't mean intellectual knowledge of, Article 20 of the Constitution and so on and so forth. Spiritual knowledge is knowledge that brings with itself this experience of bliss, of peace, of unity, and so on and so forth. So he says the jnani climbs up the stairs, right? And reaches the terrace. And there he sees sort of the unity and the oneness of God. The Vijnani, he says, climbs down back those stairs and is able to see that wonderful unity or whole sort of the underlying unity and oneness of being that he saw in that highest experience, also in this world of multiplicity, in this world of forms, right? So and that is precisely the argument that Sri Aurobindo has. And he develops this, for those of you interested, in his poem Savitri. The second book of Savitri is called The Traveler of the World Stairs. So he describes the world as sort of, you climb to that highest experience of oneness and God, right? Which is what the ascetics have described. But he says with the ascetics, you don't end there. You come back down also and see God in this world of unity as well. Now, this is very crucial to his argument, because he then puts the following question forward. He says, it's a logical argument. I'll present it to you. You see what you feel about it. He says, why did the divine have to create this world if ultimately the final resolution was that I have to, through whatever spiritual practice, discipline, ultimately escape the world and go into that original state of bliss? Then why create this world? Right? This is the problem this is a big problem in philosophy called the Theodicy Problem, which is the idea that how do I reconcile the suffering in this world with God's omnipotence? Now, if God is that, in the Indian tradition, God is not some sort of anthropomorphic figure sitting up there, but the principle of existence. If God already has that unity and oneness and bliss, right? God is already possessed of that in the highest impersonal absolute. Then why did this world of forms, this world of multiplicity, this world of ultimately suffering and death, which is what constitutes our world, why did this world have to be created? What did the divine gain by it? The only answer that the ascetics can offer is basically you suffer, and once you are sort of once you go through that suffering well, then you rise back to the original state, right? This is what's called a soul-making theodicy. The idea being that you sort of, the world is a gymnasium and your soul gets strong with every hit that it gets, and then you rise to the highest principle again. But the question that Sri Aurobindo puts is, but then why did the divine have to create this world? Surely there must be some sort of underlying divine plan even in this world. So he says, not only is the divine to be accessed in that ascetic sort of high experience, but also is to be accessed in this world, right? Otherwise, he says, this becomes an eternal delirium of the eternal, because there's no reason why this world should exist, right? So if someone were to ask Adi Shankaracharya, why does this world exist? Why does God put us through so much suffering? The answer would be ultimately, so that you get rid of your ignorance and you rise into the knowledge of the higher spiritual planes. Okay, that's fine. But then why did he have to do this in the first place? Because there's no, if I were to put it in corporate law terms, there's no value add, right? There's nothing being added to our life, to our experience, other than needless suffering. The way around that is what Sri Aurobindo argues. For those of you interested, this is in the first book of his book, Life Divine, where he says that there is a divine reason for the world affirming spirituality as well, right? Because that's the only reason in which you can reconcile God's omnipotence with the suffering that you see around us, meaning that the suffering is leading to a greater world in this world that we have, not just that at the end of it, you go off into a cave and rush off into, a high spiritual experience, because then this world is left to its own devices. And that somehow, doesn't seem to be a correct answer. It leaves something unanswered. So that's his sort of answer to the life denying and the life affirming spirituality. I'll just make two quick comments to point you in two sort of directions which are quite current in academic philosophy today. The first is this idea of panpsychism, which is, I guess, one of the most famous proponents of it is famous philosopher David Chalmers, who proposed this idea of the hard problem of consciousness. So panpsychism is this idea that that consciousness, that they don't call it divine consciousness, but they just say consciousness, is or that underlying consciousness which binds everything together exists in this world as well, right? And that is what is actually the fundamental building block of this world, right? So that's a place where modern sort of philosophy is interacting with some of these old ideas. So that's point number one. Point number two, I just want to make is a large part of these ideas actually Sri Aurobindo felt, and this is where his works become important. He felt that many of the commentators, Adi Shankaracharya, Ramanuja and others, had misinterpreted the original scriptures. So he says that if you read the Veda, if you read the original Vedantic scriptures, especially the Ishopanishad, if you read the Gita, he says that they actually were life affirming. It is because of the interposition of some very strong and powerful commentators, especially like Adi Shankaracharya, that the idea became quite current that, this is a life denying ascetic spiritual discipline. So if you want to do this, you have to basically leave society, become a sannyasi and go off into a cave, that it can't be done here and now in this world. And that was something that he felt had made Indian society weak. He said that there was that the kind of we had gained knowledge at the expense of life. We had gained the riches of the spirit because of the poverty of life, right? So that he felt had actually weakened us very much. And so if you read his spiritual thought philosophy, one of the sort of core sentiments you will find is not just knowledge or peace or love, which are sort of primary components, but strength and power, right? Because he felt that strength and power are fundamental components of sort of a life-affirming spiritual practice as well. And so those were things that he laid stress on very much, which is also why in the Indian nationalist movement, right, you see that kind of language being used as well. Because for him, spiritual practice was not divorced from work, from life, but it was a manifestation of it. So in his, in the Karma Yoga and in the Bande Mataram, during the rise of the Indian nationalist movement, he spoke with a religious passion, with a religious fervor. By religious, I mean it in the broadest sense, not in any dogmatic sense of any X or Y creed or, any caste or anything like that. He sort of tried to gather the resources of Indian spiritual traditions and pour them out onto life, rather than accept that the highest state was an ascetic state, which he felt had left Indian society spiritually rich, but materially completely destroyed. Right? And he wanted to reverse that. And he said that an Indian Renaissance will come where the riches of the spirit will also be, will engage with active life, much like, the way the Gita is structured as well. So that was sort of broadly how he was approaching the issue. And yeah.
Very fascinating, sir. I think Ian wants to ask a question now.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I think that was a brilliant insight into his philosophy. So we know that Sri Aurobindo always blended his spiritual work with his political work, and it's not easy to demarcate the two. But if we were to do so, how would you say that Sri Aurobindo's spiritual writings, this idea of personal liberation, of attaining higher levels of consciousness, how do you think that influenced his understanding of, let's say, an individualist movement? Or how do you think that influenced his conception of how to balance individual rights with collective interests in society?
Okay, so that's a big and difficult question. So let me try and see if I can, yeah. So Sri Aurobindo, this question is answered or he explores it in great detail in the first 6 chapters of his book, The Human Cycle. So I just want to point that out, flag that out for you if any of you are interested. So his idea basically is the following. He says that there are 3 gunas or 3 psychological forces which are at play at any time in the world, right? And this will be common to those of you who know Sankhya or who have read the Gita. Tamas, Rajas, and Sattva. Now, these are not, before anyone starts thinking of garlic and ginger and sattvic food, this is not that. These are 3 psychological forces that are in existence anytime in nature. Tamas is the force of inertia, conservatism, obscurity, lethargy. Rajas is the force of activity. It's the kinetic force of creation. And Sattva is the force of sympathy, illumination, harmony, and so on and so forth, right? Now, in his argument, if the predominant force, right, the social force, I'm not talking about individuals, the predominant social force in a society says tamasic, you would expect to find a society where the individual is subsumed to the collective. Because the idea of individuation or individual differentiation has not yet arisen. You think in terms of the collective, right? So in primitive societies, for example, the idea of the collective, the idea of the whole was stronger than the idea of the individual itself, right? As he says, this Rajasic force grows out of the Tamasic force, the idea of progress, the idea of individual freedom, the idea of me finding my own identity, me finding my own set of values and truths, independent of the authority of any convention or of anyone else outside, whether it be the Pope or the church or the family or whatever scripture in the world. That idea of individuals finding that authority of something which is authentic, which is within themselves, arises when this Rajasic force arises, right? Now, in his view, in this stage of development, there is, and I find this quite interesting, he says there will be an inevitable conflict between the individual and the community. Because the community has what he calls a sort of collective identity of its own, which is being threatened by the individual which is trying to pull itself out. Right? And so he says there is going to be a necessary conflict. Right? Now, he argues that in civilized societies, what this will look like is an ordered conflict through the mechanism of rights. Right? Now, he's not saying it's good or bad or anything else, right? He's simply saying that there is going to be an ordered conflict where the individual is going to try and arrogate to himself or herself as much space to be able to decide their own life, their own values, independent of convention, independent of social authority, which is the predominant mode of social organization in the early primitive forms in the Tamasic stage, right? It's only, he says, as this force of sattva, right, which is this force of harmony, this force of purity, sort of develops, and this is an evolutionary step-by-step sort of thing. As and when it develops, then he says we can think about what he calls in chapter 6 of the human cycle, the ideal law of social development, which is the poise where communities realize that they exist to service the individual and not for themselves, to allow and create space for individuals to achieve maximum self-actualization, self-freedom. But at the same time, individuals also realize that that society is not just a collection of individuals, but has a sort of common collective culture in and of itself, which is valuable and worth preserving more than just a summation of individuals within it. Now, this latter is what he calls, and to the best of my knowledge, he's the only person who uses this expression. He calls it the group soul. So what he says is that there are two fundamental realities, he says, in that any political system needs to sort of balance. And if it doesn't balance, then there's going to be some disequilibrium and there will be some corrective force that will come in. The first is the individual soul looking for space to actualize, to find its own freedom, right? And it need not be the highest spiritual freedom, even basic material freedoms, basic freedoms to political freedoms and so on and so forth. But that's the space for the individual soul. And then he calls it the group soul, right? Now, this is essentially the debate that, in modern political theory, if you read the debate, say, for example, between Michael Sandel and John Rawls, or between Charles Taylor and John Rawls, right? The idea of liberals versus communitarians. This is the same debate. So what Sri Aurobindo says is that in the early stages of society, there is this strong community which is going to impose on the individual. Right? The idea of me and mine doesn't exist. The idea is usually you define your identity with your family, your clan, your tribe, your guild, whatever else. Slowly, individualization or individuation begins to happen. As that does, there is going to be an ordered conflict between the group and the individual. Only when you rise to a sort of more refined state of being, now, whether this is 50 years, 100 years, 200 years into the future, I won't there's no prophecy on that. But at that higher stage of being, these two fundamental components can be harmonized, the individual soul and the group soul. And if there is an excessive emphasis on either one of them, he says that system is going to be in disequilibrium. So if we are we don't pay attention to, say, collective goods, public goods, right? Then that, he says, to the group soul, that, he says, is then going to lead to a sort of corrective movement where the community is going to sort of want to clamp down on individual rights. At the same time, if the conventions are very strong and individual freedom doesn't find its space to be, then there is going to be a sort of pushback from individuals against the community or the state. So it's in his view, sort of these two forces are currently sort of vying and fighting with each other in this sort of psychological evolutionary structure until they can be finally harmonized. So I'll just end with this. He in his human cycle, this is in chapter 1, he comes up with a 5-stage description or mega history of society, which he takes off from the German social theorist Lamprecht. So he says society goes through, in his argument, 5 stages, which will perhaps tie into your question, Ayan, which is, the first stage is what he calls as the symbolic stage. This is the stage where sort of the religious institutions are sort of predominant in society, right? But they are living institutions. So for example, an example of this he describes as the earliest Vedic ages. Then he says there is something called the conventional age. The conventional age is when the living spirit of those religious formulas goes away and we're just left with dead ceremony or rites. You're left with only the form, not the substance, right? Which is what he says had happened to India, right? Where we had basically become an excessively, there was a lot of external religiosity without the internal spiritual significance of it. We were doing all sorts of things, following the Shastras for breakfast, lunch, and dinner without understanding why, right? So he says that's the second stage, the age of convention. Now, when the age of, and this he says is a natural thing, right? Because the masses are not going to be able to understand the true symbolic meaning of the original thought. He says when the convention becomes very cramping, when individuals realize that this convention has no meaning or value for life, then there is going to be what he calls the age of individualism and reason, which is where individuals accept no authority, no convention other than their own mind. They insist on proof, they insist on experience. This is the age where authenticity and sort of the only claim to truth is my own. And this he calls the age of individualism and reason. It's the age of seeking, it's the age of questioning, it's the age of disagreeing with pre-established conventions, which is perhaps where we are now, right? So it sort of deconstructs convention, and out of that deconstruction, right, where the individual sort of revolts against all this cramping conventional bonds and asks why this, why that. From that, he says, will come the age of subjectivity or the age of spirituality, which is where deeper forms of individual self-actualization and freedom consistent with communal harmony are going to emerge, right? These are going to be instances where collective goods or the collective doesn't impinge upon individuals, but in fact facilitates individual growth, which is the ideal, right? And at the same time, the individual sort of contributes to collective development, realizing that the individual is not just, you know, one sort of small little atomic existence in and of himself or herself, but part of a broader, larger collective being. That, he says, that sort of ideal final culmination, he says, is inevitable. Now, whether it comes about easily or it comes about through large scale suffering and so on and so forth, that, he says, depends on man. But ultimately, the individual being and the collective being, which he calls the two sort of fundamental pillars, need to harmonize. And if they don't, if we think that we can solve for one and leave the other by the wayside, he says, but obviously nature is going to react to that disequilibrium and come back. So then you will expect to find a response, and until you can achieve a final equilibrium, it's not going to work out. Something like that is what his views are.
Right. Thank you, sir. So now we'll move on to audience questions. If you have any question, please drop them in the chat. We'll only be able to take limited questions concerning that we're already over time. First question, Agrima Agrawal wants to ask, so what is the meaning of the concept of self-involution of consciousness that Aurobindo talked about?
Yeah, okay. So you guys are asking all the difficult questions that are... So let me, in fact, luckily enough, I have extracted only one quote. This is from the Life Divine. So was that Garima who asked it? What? Sorry, I didn't get the name.
Agrima.
Okay. So Agrima, this is a quote from page 5 of his work, The Life Divine. And the question you've asked, unfortunately, I don't think has a simple answer, but there is an answer. So the answer is found in this small quote. The idea is, so what does self-involution has two meanings. Has two parts to it, two constituents, self and involution. Now, let's just start with what involution means. So involution means that something is involved in something, right? So the argument is, let me put it this way, okay. You take the normal Darwinian story of evolution, right? Which is that from matter, from material objects, from the stone and from soil and whatever else, somehow life arose, right? Life organized itself. Life in basic, simple forms of organization, which have then become more and more complex in the plant and the animal kingdom, right? Now, from life, somehow the principle of, from inanimate came animate or life. From animate life, somehow the principle of mind arose, right? So human beings, you and I, what defines us or what separates us from, from my dog or from anything else is the fact that we are thinking beings. We have this idea of self-reflexivity, that I can question my own ideas, I can question myself, and I can ask and examine about my place in the world, right? Now, the question, the very difficult question is, how did this principle of mind emerge from non-mind? How did mind emerge from or evolve from something, from life, from animate life, which doesn't have mind? How did animate life emerge from inanimate matter? Right? At historically, one argument, okay, one point you can make is at some point, there was some first species which had that, right? Now it could be the first Homo sapien or the first Homo erectus or whatever, when that first principle of incipient mind came about, right? That's one answer you can give. And that's a question for perhaps archaeologists or historians, and we can go about figuring that out. Assuming you answer that question, assuming you find that, the question still arises.
So I think you
Sir, you have muted.
Sorry, is this fine?
Yeah.
So the question would arise then is, yes, you've described the mechanics of it, but you've not described the why of it, right? Why did mind evolve from non-mind? Now the answer, and this is the Vedantic answer, which Sri Aurobindo builds upon, is that X can evolve out of Y only if X is already involved in Y. There's a very famous in Buddhist scripture, when you read the idea that something cannot come out of nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Right? So the idea is that the principle of mind was already involved in matter, was already involved in life. The principle of animate life was already involved in inanimate matter. It was involved, but it was latent. It was not yet active. So the story of evolution then becomes a story of these latent principles of consciousness, of different categories, of different, different complexities of consciousness emerging or uncovering or unfolding themselves, is the story of evolution. Right? Now that's point one. Point two, and this is where things get very interesting. If you accept this much of the story, then the Indian spiritual tradition tells you that the principle of mind is not the last principle of evolution. Why will evolution stop with us? I mean, if you step back sometimes on those gloomy days and think that, look at the world and say that, is this the final principle of evolution? I doubt anyone would come up with an answer saying yes. Right? We are clearly imperfect beings. So the Indian spiritual tradition says that there are principles or ranges of consciousness which are beyond the mind as well. These are called supra-rational, right? They are not anti-rational, they're not against mind, but they are beyond the mind, supra-rational. These are described in great detail, but these are broadly those intuitive or spiritual or soul faculties that you speak about, right? There is an entire description of these in the Indian sort of spiritual psychological tradition, which we won't go into. So what the Indian tradition says, Agrima, I'm just answering your question, but it's a slightly complicated question, is those further principles are involved in us, and they will evolve from us much like we evolved from the previous ones, right? So when a spiritual seeker or when a spiritual aspirant or when a realized master claims to have higher ranges of experience, supra-rational experiences beyond the mind and the senses, right? Those are simply latent faculties in us which are waiting to evolve out from us, much like we thinking animals, human beings, you and I, evolved from the unthinking animals, much like the unthinking animals evolved from the sort of inanimate material objects of the world. Now, so this is the evolutionary story, right? Now, what we need to identify for this is, so where are we going? What's the end point? That's the teleological argument of the Indian tradition. The Indian tradition is clearly teleological. It says there is an end point. We are going somewhere, right? Adi Shankara will tell you are going to the Nirguna Brahman. Buddha will tell you that you are going to Asat, to non-being, to Nirvana. Sri Aurobindo will tell you something else. The idea is that the highest principle of existence in the Vedantic tradition is what is called Sat Chit Ananda. Truth, consciousness, bliss. So it's a state of experience which is quite unlike ours. We are small little creatures, not defined by great amounts of bliss. We are defined by amounts of suffering. We are defined by disharmony and disunity. And we're defined by death. Right? Those are sort of the basic principles of existence. The highest forms of existence, the highest spiritual states. And then that's what Abhineet was asking about in the first question, which the ascetics have described. That principle of Sat Chit Ananda, the highest state of being, which is wholeness, unity, self-existent bliss. That is the highest principle to which we are going. Now, this is called superconscient. Superconscient meaning, it is fully, completely conscious of itself. It's self-possessed of its own consciousness, of its own delight. It's very hard for us. We can speak about this in intellectual terms, but it's very hard for us to even imagine or to let alone experience what it feels like. But that's the argument in the Indian tradition, right? It would be very hard. It would have been very hard for a monkey to think about us sitting here and talking about in language and thinking about the world, right? But it's a similar evolutionary step. That's the argument. Now, that highest principle of Sat Chit Ananda is buried in its precise opposite, in inert matter. Matter is exactly the opposite. It's dead. It's not conscious. Right? There is no unity. There is no bliss, nothing. Slowly out of inert matter, that highest principle is unfolding itself, evolving out of itself. So what is the self-involution? The divine Satchitananda, the highest states of experience, the highest principle of existence really, right? This is what's called Vijnanam in the Vedantic tradition, has involved itself. It's sort of, in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo describes it as playing hide and seek. It has fallen and sort of taken on the form of inert matter. And slowly it is now evolving it back to its highest state. Right? So in the biblical story of the fall from grace and our forgotten self, our higher self. Now, if you take it in this symbolic sense, that's what that story is referring to. So the idea is that the highest state of existence has fallen into the state of inert matter, death, just lifeless death matter, and slowly these principles which are latent are evolving out of it, and we are becoming more and more complex and reaching more and more to that highest state of existence, which is the divine Satchitananda. So that's the self-involution argument, right? For those of you who are interested, by the way, this is very closely related to the Leela argument. Sri Aurobindo was a believer in the Leela, because the next question comes, okay, wonderful, fantastic, but why? To which no answer has ever satisfied any human intellect. But the answer that Sri Aurobindo gives is the divine does this for the Leela of creation, for the Leela of expressing itself in this world and of creating oneness and unity in this world of multiplicity, right? So that's the idea of Leela. Why do we exist? Right? This is like the answer of, I think it's the Chandogya Upanishad, which it says, by bliss we came, by bliss we exist, and to bliss we shall go. So the why question is ultimately is that we are recovering that sense of lost oneness and bliss through this very painful, long, excruciating, meandering process of evolution. The highest principle of consciousness is recovering itself through these sort of intermediate steps and scaffoldings. So that's what self-involution means. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you may want to read this quote at page 5 of the Life Divine, which sort of provides a summary statement of this argument that I've just outlined right now.
Thank you very much, sir. So I think we only have space for one more final question before we close. So this is a question from Sivang Soni. I'll just read it out. When it comes to the problem of theodicy, don't you feel the assumption that God created the world is flawed when you consider the Vedantic distinction between Ishwar and Paramatma? When creation is seen as an instrument to reach God realization and every soul as Paramatma in ignorance, won't creation precede existence of God in the state of Satchitananda?
That's a very detailed question. I don't think I can answer this here, but I'll just say two things. So the first is one has to just be a little, there is truth in this question. Again, I'm presenting Sri Aurobindo's view on this question. There is truth in this question. The first thing, and this is just a general remark, is sometimes words can be misleading. So, we use words like divine and God, which can have a range of multiple meanings, right? Even when I use the word absolute or self with a capital S, it can mean many, many different things. At least in Sanskrit, there is a sort of fairly detailed vocabulary where each of these terms have a specific meaning. So in the Life Divine, for example, Sri Aurobindo distinguishes between the Brahman, Ishvara, Atman, Shakti, and what each of these terms mean, right? In different places, each of these could be referred to as God. But that doesn't really help us once, it's fine at a sort of superficial level, but once you're actually getting into the discussion in detail, then we need specific terms to be able to identify different aspects of creation. So part of the answer will come in that. Now that's just a sort of methodological thing. Just on substance, so if you're this question is sort of answered in, I think it's chapter 7 of the Life Divine, which is a chapter called The Eternal and the Individual, where you will find a discussion on this idea. In Sri Aurobindo's view, it's not the divine that created this world is not separate from this world. The divine is not just transcendent, right? This is the idea of deism, that the divine created this world but is not involved in this world. In Sri Aurobindo's view, the divine created this world out of the substance of his being. So the divine is as much involved in this world as he is in his sort of highest state of existence high up there. So the problem of theodicy, which is the idea that how do we reconcile suffering with God's omnipotence? Sort of one of the supports of that argument is removed when we make the argument, which is Sri Aurobindo's argument, that the divine is also involved in the suffering. So it's not that the divine is imposing suffering on his creatures while he's sitting up there, sipping a pina colada. He's involved here also in the suffering itself, right? So that's one of the arguments of, that is one of the sort of issues that will answer your question. The second is but I'm guessing when you say Paramatma, you're speaking about the same as the Purushottama in the Gita. So the Purushottama is the highest self, right? The Ishvara is the personal self manifested in this universe. They are different forms of the ultimately the same Godhead. So the way I understand your question is that distinction between Ishvara and Purushottama is not an essential distinction, right? But it's sort of a functional distinction. Ultimately, it is the same divine self. But again, these questions require sort of, it's difficult to answer such detailed questions in sort of a summary formation. I should say, since questions like this are coming, if any of you would like to discuss this in greater detail, you could perhaps email me and I can refer you to the precise text in question. But Shivang, this is a wonderful question. You should really read chapter 7, which is the eternal and the individual, and another chapter in book 2 of the Life Divine, which is entitled Brahman, Ishvara, and Atman, I think. That sort of gives a description of Sri Aurobindo's argument on this point.
Thank you, sir. So I think that's all the time that we had for audience questions. We just had one final question planned from our side to close the discussion. Just some of your brief thoughts on what value does studying Sri Aurobindo's work today in 2022 have for us as students, as young people, but specifically as law students trying to understand law, the society, and so forth?
Well, I can say a couple of things. So the first is India has a great spiritual heritage in terms of extraordinary founds and sources of knowledge, which are extremely powerful. Often, these have either been because we are in a generally irreligious age and sort of we are proudly atheistic. These sometimes tend to perhaps get ignored and not fully understood. It's fine if one rejects it after studying them in detail, but sometimes they tend to get ignored. And especially because many of us may not know Sanskrit, these texts can be a little foreboding and they're simply inaccessible to us. So very practically, one of the things that Sri Aurobindo is useful for, that he does for us, is that he's able to synthesize in English, in easy to consume vocabulary, somewhat easy to consume in some parts. He's a difficult writer, I won't lie. He's able to sort of present vast streams of spiritual thought to us in sort of a modern idiom. And so what would otherwise take you a large amount of time, you'll have to invest a lot of energy into it, you can perhaps do with just one or two of his books. So that's something that I think is useful. The second thing is, generally when you speak of sort of spiritual or religious things, we usually confuse them, I's role, and we usually confuse them with external forms of religiosity. We confuse them with, not without reason, there is good reason, it's sort of confused with superstition, with rites, with ceremonies, with polysyllabic Sanskrit mantras, the meaning of which very few people know, and so on and so forth, right? That is often what has become of public religiosity or public spiritual practice. What Sri Aurobindo does very wonderfully is that he is able to present Indian spiritual thought in a very logical, coherent, argumentative fashion to us, right? To be able to answer some of those basic questions, those eternal questions that we had, the last generation had, and 20 before them also did. Right? Basic questions of the first principles of existence. And the Indian spiritual tradition often is not seen as a set of coherent and cogent metaphysical or psychological a body of knowledge with claims made in those domains. So Sri Aurobindo sort of helps us navigate through those vast bodies of knowledge in a modern idiom. And that, I think, maybe is useful and relevant to all of you, either if you're just interested in it for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of investigation, right? For the sake of trying to find out what is true and what is good. And that's very useful. The second more sort of practical applied part of it as well is that, especially if you read his political philosophy, the world, your understanding of the world is only as good as your understanding of the historical forces that have produced it. And especially in a world like today, where things change so quickly, and intellectual trends and theories sort of are like fashions of the day, and there is such a vast churn that is happening. His political philosophy is useful in sort of grounding yourself in a broader historical context, which gives you greater stability, which helps you understand the world better and understand the various forces of the world better. And so as a very practical sort of step forward for those of you who are looking to think about some of the larger problems of the world, right? Or who are looking to think about questions of politics, questions of social development. His works on political theory are able to, again, synthesize vast streams of knowledge, which hopefully will give you a better and more secure understanding of sort of the very fluid nature of the world in which we are today. So I think those are the two things that perhaps I think are very useful in studying Sri Aurobindo. I should say one final thing, which I haven't mentioned, is that so one of his disciples, who was a very famous singer, I don't know if you know him, Dilip Kumar Roy, once wrote to Sri Aurobindo saying that, how did you become such an extraordinary philosopher? And Sri Aurobindo wrote to him saying, I was never, he said the word never thrice, a philosopher. He says, I was a poet and a politician. He says it is another matter that I've had to write philosophy, because philosophy is for those people who can't understand anything without explanation. So you can go to Sri Aurobindo for his philosophy, but you can also go to him for his poetry. He is known as a philosopher, perhaps less so as a poet, but his poetry is for the sake of poetry, for the beauty of poetry, for the wonderful insights that he's able to capture in his poetry, which in philosophy can be quite dense. His poetry is wonderful. He wrote about 3,000 pages of poetry before he wrote the Savitri, which is, by the way, the largest epic poem in English in blank verse ever written. So his poetry, for simply for the sake of poetry, for enjoyment, for also for for the concepts that he's speaking about, that also I think is something wonderful. As I teach also in a law school myself, I have a constant grouse that we teach too much through prose, not enough through poetry. So perhaps I can put this one idea out as well, that you may want to read him not just as a philosopher for the two reasons I mentioned, but also as a poet, perhaps, for the delightful poems that he has written.
Thank you, Mr. Raag Yadava. That was a wonderful, wonderful session. I'm sure that the audience has a lot to think about after this session. So I'll just like to call Ayan for a vote of thanks and we'll close.
Yes, thank you, Abhini. First of all, of course, I'd like to thank Mr. Raag Yadava for graciously allowing his time. I can personally say that my interest in Sri Aurobindo's work has increased many, many times after listening to you, sir. So thank you so much for sparing your time. We'd also like to thank our VC, Professor Sri Krishna Dev Rao, and our registrar, Professor Harpreet Kaur ma'am, for allowing us to host this webinar using the college Zoom ID. We'd also like to thank the college IT department for helping us out technically with all of the logistics behind hosting the webinar. And of course, at the end, we'd like to thank the student body and the philosophy club members for attending this webinar. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And best of luck for your philosophy club. I hope you guys have a wonderful year.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending.